Okay. There we go. Sorry, guys. I clicked it and it wasn't actually open. I thought it was open. I remember opening it and clicking on it, and it never apparently started. All right, so skin. We already know a lot about the skin and how its defenses work as far as like keratin and lysozyme breaking down peptidoglycan, everything like that. We just talked about making blisters, which is separation of that upper layers of skin from the lower layers and filling with fluid. Pretty much any of the secretions on the skin can help with protecting from microbes, whether it's the oils or the sweat, or even the existence of other microbes on our skin. The microbes on your skin can actually make their own antimicrobial compounds to, again, help with protecting from invaders. They can take up the stadium seats. They basically also have guns to shoot away. That's what their antimicrobial compounds are for, to keep the bad guys away. And they also maintain a certain pH on the skin and other areas of the body that are unfriendly to any of the incoming pathogens. That's pretty much it for that. The most common microbes that are going to be apparent on your microbiome of your skin is going to be Staphylococcus epidermidis and Propionibacterium acnes. So you've heard of this as P. acnes. Probably if you watch any skincare commercials or anything about dermatology at all, because P. acnes is the cause usually of what's going to be leading to acne development. About 4% of the population houses Staph aureus as part of their biome. I'm going to let you know right now, I happen to be one of those people. You usually won't even know about it, honestly, unless you have some sort of a boil or something develop that isn't treated the way that you might treat acne or something. And then they realize, oh, okay, this is staph. Staph does not mean MRSA, okay? Staph just means it is Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. We've already learned that most, if not all, Staph aureus that exists in the world is going to be resistant to penicillin, but that doesn't mean every other antibiotic in the world. We'll talk about MRSA here in a moment. It is a potential pathogen that if it invades deeper tissues can cause certain infections. And most of these are going to be isolated within hair follicles where it's like a little bit more away from the dryness of the atmosphere, in sweat glands and things like that's where most of your biome is going to be existing, though it can be everywhere on the skin. This is a table describing the different types of lesions that are associated with skin presentation, associated with these pathogens. So we're going to talk about bullae, which are a lot like giant blisters, and then things like papules, petechiae, where we have bursting of blood vessels and stuff like that. So these are some of the terms we will be using. We'll start with MRSA and other soft tissue infections. So with these guys, we're talking about the presence of lesions, especially with MRSA. You will usually see it looks like a pimple, maybe not exactly like a pimple, more raised. It'll have a hotness when you touch it, maybe a little bit firm in the area as well. There's usually pus associated with it. And these are almost always going to be resistant to at least one antibiotic, especially if it's MRSA. We already know they're all staph. Staph in general is already resistant to penicillin. MRSA, more specifically, is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So it's resistant to methicillin, which is a very strong antibiotic. But if it's resistant to methicillin, it's also resistant to antibiotics that are less strong. So it's like an umbrella, essentially. If you're resistant to methicillin, you're resistant to all of the ones that are used previous to that in treatment regimes. So yeah, so fevers can sometimes come about if you had these infections for a long time, and it can lead to development of even more deep tissue infections later on. So this is caused by Staphylococcus aureus that is resistant to methicillin and other less strong antibiotics. There are still antibiotics that we have in our graph that can treat these guys, but they're usually associated with toxic effects. Staph is gram-positive. It's a coccus, obviously it's in the name, so it's round cells. It's staphylo arrangement, so it's grape-like or irregular clusters. It's not motile. It's pretty resistant as far as a non-endospore forming organism is going to go. It withstands salt, but it doesn't prefer salt. So it's not a halophile, it's not salt loving, but it's halo resistant. So it can withstand it, as well as extremes in pH and certain high temperatures as well. So you can dry it out and it will still survive even months later. It produces some enzymes that are associated with either its ability to infect you or for our identification purposes. Some things that help it infect you might be hyaluronidase, for example, which breaks down hyaluronic acid in your extracellular matrix so it can infect deeper tissues. So that's an example of one of these guys. Lipase to break down the oils that usually would protect you from infections. They can break it down and create the ability to colonize your skin. We've learned about catalase. Catalase breaks down toxic oxygen byproducts like hydrogen peroxide, which is part of our defense against oxygen-free radicals. So they're able to break that down as well because they're also aerobic organisms. So they can survive in oxygen environments, and they're not going to be as easily killed by hydrogen peroxide. So that's a problem. They also make some enzyme called coagulase. This is an enzyme that coagulates plasma. And your plasma is part of the things that will help water down your pathogens as well as any toxins that they might produce. So if they can coagulate that, that makes it the plasma less effective at watering down. And it's a way that we can identify it as well. So the coagulase test is used to identify staph, specifically Staph aureus from even Staph epidermidis. Epidermidis doesn't do this. Staph aureus does. So you have a patient with a lesion, you take a sample, you mix it with rabbit plasma. So it's just plasma derived from rabbit blood. And if it coagulates that plasma, it's Staph aureus. The coagulation, we're talking about like solidification, curdling, things like that. So this is our summary table on MRSA for review later on. Next, we're going to move on to impetigo. This is a superficial bacterial infection where we see sloughing or flaking of the skin. It's usually caused by certain toxins that are made by the bacteria. This is caused by Staph aureus or Streptococcus pyogenes, which we're going to talk about more throughout the semester. But these are usually infections that affect children. It's something that's often associated with things like cradle cap, for example. You see the flaky, irritated skin associated with that. Symptoms are the same regardless of which organism is associated with it. Staph is usually what's causing the more serious effects of it, but they're almost always going to be started by strep first. And then staph kind of takes over once the environment is more friendly for staph to like really take hold of the pathogenesis of the disease. So staph makes exotoxins that are exfoliative, so essentially causing your skin cells to slough off from one another. These are exotoxins A and B. And then we also already talked about coagulase. Strep is gram-positive coccus, streptococcus. It's gram-positive and it's beta hemolytic. So this is another identifying factor that we have, clearing on a blood agar plate, right? Breaking down those red blood cells. It's also associated with strep throat, scarlet fever, pneumonia, puerperal fever, necrotizing fasciitis, certain bloodstream infections, and rheumatic fever. And that isn't all. So strep is one of those bacteria that can cause a ton of different kinds of infections and is actually one of the more concerning bacteria involved in necrotizing fasciitis, which we're not going to break down necessarily in this class. Necrotizing fasciitis is something that occurs whenever you have bacteria infecting the deeper tissues of the skin. And they don't even have to be invading necessarily from a wound, though that is the most common source of infection. Wounds, burns, anything that will open up the skin to infection, though it can be because of normal bacteria just invading deeper into the tissues and then spreading without an open wound. So with necrotizing fasciitis, what you'll see is you'll have an area of infection that is clearly red. Go to the doctor, they suspect it, they'll draw a line around it with a Sharpie, literally, and then watch to see for redness spreading outside of that line within a certain time period. If it does, they will diagnose it as necrotizing fasciitis, and then the work begins. The work being debridement of any infected area of tissue. So they will cut away tissue, starting at healthy tissue outside of the perimeter of the red area, and then everything that is red up to wherever that original lesion or area of concern began. They'll cut out all the tissue that has been affected in a way to stem the spread of infection, because antibiotics are not going to act fast enough typically once this starts. So that's debridement, removing of infected and dead tissue. Necrotizing, because the tissue will die during the process of the spread of the infection if it isn't debrided. And it's extremely difficult to contain these infections because they do spread faster than antibiotics can work. So necrotizing fasciitis often leads to loss of limbs, large amounts of tissue, and things like that. This is what we'll talk about with areas where you'll have limb loss due to spread of infection from cellulitis that has gone too far and into deeper tissues, spreading too quickly for antibiotics to work or to be able to get to the area from low blood flow. And it just exacerbates itself from there. So necrotizing fasciitis is the flesh-eating disease. If you haven't heard about that, if you watch like horror movies like I do, like what is it called? Cabin Fever. Yes. Eli Roth horror movie. It is gross. Don't watch it if you haven't seen it. Anyways, these guys have ways to stick onto things as well as break down your extracellular matrix, and they have a hyaluronic acid capsule. So we see hyaluronic acid as friendly. That's something that we have in our own bodies. So they make a capsule out of that. And then that also allows them to evade phagocytosis. So here's some testing that we would do for strep. Whatever kind of strep you might have, whether it is associated with skin infections or throat infections, these are tests that would be used to identify it. So there's our summary for impetigo. With cellulitis, so impetigo was our skin sloughing disease where we have the exfoliative toxins and everything. Cellulitis is now our deeper tissue infection. We don't necessarily have an introductory lesion, but bacteria that are found on the surface can make their way deeper into the tissue and cause infection without an open wound introducing them. We usually have redness, swelling in an area. It's usually hot to the touch, and you'll have lines spreading out away from the infected area, showing indication of spread from the initial area of infection. It's usually common in lower legs because we have poor blood circulation, usually in cases of diabetes. So you'll get these deep tissue infections in your extremities where you have poor blood flow. So that's why it's more common in the legs. Anybody with immune compromised situations or with poor blood flow are susceptible to cellulitis. Next is staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome, SSSS. This is Staph aureus that leads to, essentially, it's like impetigo systemically. So your whole body can start sloughing skin in a way, not all of it. I'm not saying like you go down to your muscle or something, but you get these blisters anywhere on the body, especially in large areas of the body. And I'm talking large blisters that can take up like the whole like part of your arm or something. And it's common in children, little children. They get impetigo. This can advance into SSSS. My cousin's son had this. They lived in Western Kansas, and there were no doctors in the area that could treat this effectively. So they had to drive to Colorado to get treatment for their kid to have this treated. He's fine now, but this can be a recurring infection if the kid ends up having staph as part of their normal biome. The shift gets off, and they can develop this while their immune system isn't quite as strong. So looks like wrinkled tissue paper, skin. You get large lesions. This is an adult that has SSSS, and this will happen on even little kids' skin. This is where we've already started to break off some of the skin itself. And we have these, this is bothering me. We have these large blister-like vesicles forming all over. Not really vesicles, large blisters, bullous lesions is what they call them, bullae. So this is our summary table for that. Next is gas gangrene. This is also known as Clostridial myonecrosis. It's usually caused by Clostridium perfringens. And this is Clostridium. We already know it's endospore forming. Endospore formers are always gram-positive. So we know it's gram-positive, we know it's endospore forming. It's Clostridium. One of the things that we also kind of know, you're not required to know it, but we talk about it sometimes, is that Clostridium species are anaerobic. So they don't do well with oxygen at all. So oxygen exposure can actually be deadly to them. They're not prepared to deal with it. So they need anaerobic conditions in order to cause this disease, which means it's usually associated with deep tissue infection. I mean deep. So we're talking getting stabbed with a bayonet, for example, in like the 1700s. I don't know, in the Revolutionary War, or with a knife, or stepping on a nail can sometimes introduce these bacteria as well. Clostridium perfringens is a pretty ubiquitous bacterium. It's in soil, it's in the vaginal canal, it's on skin, it's all over the place. And these endospores are everywhere, but it's not really a danger, kind of like tetanus. It's not really a danger until it gets deeper into the tissue where it can have its anaerobic effects. So gas gangrene comes in two forms: the anaerobic cellulitis, where it's going to stay in the area where it's created the infection, or we have true myonecrosis, where it's going to spread throughout the body from that site. It leads to true necrosis, so death and a breakdown of the tissue that is being infected. It'll turn black after it's died. And a lot of times you'll see areas that are infected. This is like one of the tamer pictures of it, but this is what we call dry gas gangrene. There's also wet gas gangrene, where your skin, as it is being infected, the bacteria release gases. And we're learning about some of that stuff actually in class. When we talked previously about sulfur being reduced, right? Sulfur reduction in your SIM and your TSIA auger. Well, in our aerobic respiration, we use oxygen as our final electron acceptor to take your protons and your electrons, make H2O as your product. Well, these guys might take a sulfate product and turn it into H2S instead. So H2S is actually a gas. In our media, we turn that gas into a solid by binding it with an iron compound, turning it into a black precipitate. So we don't see as much of the gas made. But in your skin, in your tissue, in your muscles, if these bacteria get that deep, they'll make that H2S gas and they'll collect in your muscle tissue. That leads to expansion of the muscle tissue, and like you're blowing up a balloon too much with air, will want to burst. And so the tissue itself can become damaged from the gas collection. We'll also have leaking of fluid into those areas. So you'll have the actual muscle tissue and deep tissue will be weeping fluid, creating these large blisters that are filled with black liquid and can start oozing through the tissue itself. This is where they'll introduce things like fasciotomies, where if you're having an infection or an injury where you're having too much fluid in the area, they will cut slits in the skin to allow it to expand so that it doesn't rip itself open. You're more susceptible to infection and unable to heal properly if the skin rips itself open, as opposed to if you cut it open with a sterile instrument, for example. So that's what fasciotomies are for. So we can let the liquid and the air, the gas that's being made, the H2S being made, escape the body so that it doesn't cause so much damage. This is a cross section of muscle tissue that is infected with Clostridium perfringens. This is a gas pocket there in the middle. You can see there's several areas of gas. That big white kind of area in the middle is the gas filled space. And those little dark dots are the bacteria, and the pink is the muscle tissue. So you can get an idea of how this would happen with gas gangrene. It's not only caused by Clostridium perfringens, it can be caused by other bacteria too, but this is the one that you need to know about for our class. So gas production in the tissue will have weeping of fluid from that inflammatory response and everything like that. So that's our summary table for that. Next, we're moving into the vesicular and pustular rash diseases. We're going to start with the poxes. First, chicken pox. It's a pretty mild disease if you have a healthy immune system. This should just be a presentation of the pox, the itchy spots themselves, and then it should resolve on its own. Most people are going to see this in their adolescence, but you can get this as an adult if you haven't been previously exposed. We vaccinate for it now, but we didn't back whenever I was a kid. When I was a kid in the 80s, we had chickenpox parties, and you would, if someone in your class got chickenpox, then all the kids would be invited over to a party, and everybody would get chickenpox. It was a way to vaccinate, but they just didn't realize that's what they were doing. So live, active vaccination. That's how I got chickenpox. So the spots themselves are itchy. And of course, kids being not very clean will want to scratch them and get secondary bacterial infections. Those secondary bacterial infections will be what causes the scarring, not the pox themselves. I have a ton of chickenpox scars because my mom let me scratch it. She was just sick of dealing with it. So just let me get my scars. I guess it's fine. It's not really that serious unless you're immune compromised. It actually takes about 10 to 20 days for symptoms to show. You go to your chickenpox party and a couple weeks later, you've got chickenpox. You don't have it right away. You can be contagious before that. So it usually takes a couple of weeks to resolve and you'll get secondary infections. All right, shingles is whenever you have chickenpox that becomes latent in your body. Chickenpox is caused by the virus, by the way, varicella zoster. It is a herpes virus. So varicella zoster being a herpes virus, human herpes virus 3, it will hide out in your nerves and then come out later on when you are older and your immune system starts to wane. Usually after your 50s, so it can show up much earlier than that. Yeah, it can come out for anybody. Like, I don't know, it just usually is related to stress or a lowered immune system for whatever reason. You could be sick with something else and cause it to come out. But yeah, it just depends on your immune system. If it can keep it in check, then you're lucky usually. Because shingles can be very painful, especially the older that you are. It comes back out along the nerve that it hit on. So your first initial chickenpox will be systemic, kind of itchiness system. I'm talking about on your skin. So all over your body, on your skin. Whereas shingles will appear along the nerve that it was hiding on. So usually if it hid in a nerve that's in the head, it'll come out on the head, or on the trunk, it'll come out on the trunk on the side of the body. Yeah, there you go. On the nerves in your butt. There you go. Look at you. I'd rather have it on my butt than my face, if I'm being completely honest. Yeah. Yeah, later in life. Later in life, look out for your butt. Now you know. Um, there are vaccines available for adults to keep your immune system active so that we're keeping it in check. So that's why they say when you turn about 50, you should be getting your shingles vaccinations to keep it in check so you don't have it represent. Right. If you've only had the vaccine, you won't get shingles. Yeah. But having said that, if you had the vaccine, you don't keep up with your boosters later in life, then you can get chickenpox later in life. But the older that you are, the more likely it's going to have severe symptoms like shingles. Good question. All right, smallpox. Smallpox is a viral disease caused by the virus variola. There's two versions, variola major and minor, but it doesn't really matter too much. Variola major was the one that we were more concerned about. It has about a 30% mortality rate, which is pretty impressive for essentially a skin disease. But it had other effects on the body as well, not just the rash. It could lead to toxemia, shock, and intravascular coagulation, so basically clotting of your blood. But yeah, so that's variola major. It doesn't exist on the earth naturally anymore. We have it frozen in stores in certain countries like the US and Russia. We keep stores of it because of our concerns for bioterrorism. But there are no more natural infections on the earth. We've eliminated it thanks to vaccination. Oh, I don't want to move on just yet. The vaccine that was developed for smallpox was developed from cowpox. So what happened was back in the day, this man, Edward Jenner, noticed that milkmaids, and the reason that people we talk about, like there's this, I don't know if anybody knows about this anymore, but used to be the saying that milkmaids were so pretty. And that was because they didn't get smallpox. They didn't get smallpox because they got cowpox on their hands instead. So a little local infection of a couple lesions on their hands from milking cows that had cowpox protected them from smallpox infections. They didn't have scarring and such associated with having had smallpox. He noticed this. So he took scrapings off of cows that had cowpox and inoculated his son with cowpox by scratching it into his skin and letting, the morality of it. I mean, this is like, I don't know, the 1700s or something. So maybe 1600. I don't remember the exact. I think it's 1600s that this happened. But yeah, you know, it's not. So yeah, he literally just decided, hey, I am 100% confident in this. Took his son, inoculated his son with cowpox by scratching it into his skin, which is how we do our smallpox vaccines today, by the way. Our military still gets vaccinated for smallpox in case of bioterrorism events. So you get scratched into the skin, it creates a scab, it falls off, and you have a scar, and that's how you know somebody's been vaccinated for smallpox. They stopped vaccinating for it in the 80s. I didn't get vaccinated for it. And the vaccinations really only last about 10 years. So even if your parents are sitting there like, well, I got vaccinated, not anymore, man. Their immunity has worn off. So they're not protected. But I think I told you guys this before, Russia still vaccinates for smallpox. Fresh. Yes, he could have. Yes, exactly. It's very concerning that he thought this was an okay thing to do. But his kid was fine and did not get smallpox. The vaccine that's developed from smallpox that's still in use today, and it's the one that they use for monkeypox and other poxes as well that are proper pox viruses, is based on that situation with Edward Jenner and his kid. Cowpox is caused by a virus called vaccinia virus. Vacca means cow in Latin. So vacca, vaccine, vaccinia, they're all the same thing. So the reason that you have vaccines called vaccines is thanks to the smallpox vaccine, vaccinia virus. Vaccinia being cowpox, variola is smallpox. They're so closely related that it works. Next is hand foot. I think that's just one of the weirdest, but also coolest things to know about in vaccine history. It's very, very, very first vaccine ever. Hand, foot, and mouth disease. This is a spotted rash disease that kids can get on their face, especially in their palms of their feet, the soles of their feet, and their trunk, and on their tongue and the sides of their mouths. This is caused by a Coxsackie virus. That is an enterovirus, gets in through the gut or whatever. It's super common in kids. I mean, they're whatever. I don't know what else to say about it. Spotted, you get over it and you move on with life. Next, we have the maculopapular rash diseases. This is like measles and rubella. Do not think that mumps falls into this. Mumps is not a skin disease. We'll talk about mumps in the GI section. Measles. This is also known as rubeola. Don't need to know that, but it used to be known as rubeola. So measles has a vaccine for it, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. You need 95% of the population to be vaccinated against measles in order to protect us, because it's one of the most infectious diseases that we know of, super contagious, highly, highly contagious by air, contact, and all sorts of things. We saw an increase in the measles cases prior to COVID because we had that anti-vax movement. Go figure, a deadlier disease would come along. People are like, maybe I should get vaccinated for things. And so we've seen a drop off in the measles infections since COVID, since people started getting vaccinated again. You have sore throat, cough, you get a rash on the body, and other issues that we might see associated with other types of infection. That's the normal measles infection, but it can progress into more serious situations, leading to encephalitis or even meningitis. And it can be deadly if that happens. Not common, but it can happen. Measles can actually be deadly, which is the issue why we really need to be sure we're vaccinating. If it was just chickenpox, we wouldn't be as concerned about it. But there's a reason why we push so hard for measles vaccination. It's super contagious and can be deadly. Next is rubella. This is the German measles. It's not really an issue unless you're pregnant. We don't really even think about it. You might not even have any presentation of symptoms whatsoever. But if you're in your first trimester of pregnancy and you get infected with rubella, you're at risk for miscarriage and permanent defects in the baby. So you want to get your measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine so you can take care of possibility of spreading rubella to pregnant women or being pregnant and getting rubella. Postnatal rubella is where kids will get infected with rubella, usually going to show symptoms of rash and being sick, general, flu, cold-like symptoms. It's not too bad, and you can recover from it pretty easily. But if you get it congenitally, again, if you're a pregnant woman and you have a baby in your first trimester or later on in the pregnancy, first trimester, you're most at risk for stillbirth and miscarriage. But later on in the pregnancy, you can still have effects for congenital rubella. So this is where the baby becomes infected with rubella during the pregnancy. This can lead to permanent defects in the baby, like deafness and other issues. All right, fifth disease. I always confuse this with other diseases. Fifth disease, also known as erythema infectiosum, is caused by parvovirus B19. It's a human parvovirus. Causes low-grade fever and a slapped cheek effect. It's only really going to be an issue if you're immune compromised. Kids can get this all the time. The slapped cheek effect that it causes is actually little tiny rash underneath the skin. They're individual dots, but it just looks like it's one big old red area. And it can persist for weeks, usually, and recover easily. Yeah, it can be very uncomfortable, but you should recover just fine if you have a healthy immune system. Roseola, this is one you may not have heard of. Roseola is a rash-like disease that only has symptoms in maybe like 30% of cases. We see this in little babies. Most people who get this disease, babies or older, most of them, 70% of them, are not going to have any symptoms whatsoever. So very tame. You should be able to recover from this very easily. Though, if you do get a very high fever associated with this during the first few days of onset, you can have seizures and other issues associated with just having a high fever. So that's a possibility if you have symptoms. 100% of the population will have had this once you're adult. So you've had it. You just didn't know. I promise. Interesting one. So let's go on to warts. Isn't this nice? This is my least favorite thing in all the things that we're going to learn about in all these chapters. I don't know what it is about a wart, but I can't with them. So here we have warts are caused by HPV, human papillomavirus. There are so many strains of HPV, it is ridiculous. I mean, we're talking like dozens and dozens of strains, if not hundreds, that we may not have recognized yet. So HPV is human papillomavirus. We're going to talk about skin warts that could be anywhere on your body. And then later on in the genitourinary tract areas, we're going to talk about sexually transmitted infections And that's going to include HPV in the genital area as a sexually transmitted disease, as well as cervical cancer and other cancers that are caused by HPV. HPV doesn't just cause cervical cancer. It can cause anal cancer, oral cancer, anal cancer, and other areas of the body can get cancer from HPV. Pretty serious virus when we really break it down. It's also incredibly infectious. So HPV causes skin warts, and so does this other thing, molluscum contagiosum. It also causes warts, but it causes its own sort of wart-like illness separate. It's not an HPV virus. Okay, so different kinds of warts that exist. We have common warts that are raised. We usually see them on fingers or other body parts. We have plantar warts that are deep and flat, like this is pointing a picture at plantar wart and the toe. It's usually not raised, but it can be very painful. And then flat warts themselves can be smooth or skin colored on other areas, like larger areas of the body, like the trunk. Next, we have molluscum contagiosum. Again, not HPV. It's its own kind of virus. It leads to wart-like eruptions on the body. It's usually found in the Pacific Islands regions in the world. Children get them on pretty much anywhere on the body. Adults usually get them in the genital area associated with sexual transmission. If you're immune compromised, it can be very disfiguring. All right, leishmaniasis. This is a zoonosis, so it's usually found in animals, and it's transmitted by female sandflies. So these guys will bite you. These sandflies will bite you and transmit this infection. It can come around there's two different versions of leishmania. They can be either cutaneous, and then there's another species of leishmania that causes mucocutaneous. The cutaneous version we see in Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia, whereas mucocutaneous is Central and South America. These guys, I don't know, you get flat lesions that are painful and oozing or weeping. It can be, if it's skin, it's cutaneous. Mucocutaneous can be skin or the mucous membranes. Sandfly bites. We see an outbreak of these associated with Desert Storm, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that where our soldiers were in these areas, get bitten by sandflies and then get leishmaniasis as a result. It's treatable though. All right, cutaneous anthrax. Anthrax can affect various parts of your body, skin, GI, respiratory. It's caused by Bacillus anthracis, so we know it's endospore forming because it's Bacillus. Remember, Bacillus and Clostridium species. And endospore forming, therefore it also has to be gram positive, and we know it's a rod because it's Bacillus. So we know a lot about it already. These endospore forming guys will get either into wounds in the skin, or you can inhale them or ingest them. In this case, we're talking about the cutaneous form, so into wounds on the skin. It's found pretty much all over, like areas where you have cattle. It's considered technically a zoonosis, but if it's contracted from like farming situations or whatever, because it's maintained in cattle populations. This sore is called an eschar, I believe is how that's pronounced, but it's a black eschar. That's actually what it looks like. That's not a dramatization. That's really a wound on a guy's neck from it. And it's necrotic, and that's what cutaneous anthrax looks like. I don't know. It's 20% mortality rate if you do not treat it. Can be treated with antibiotics. It was an issue for bioterrorism. It still is an issue for bioterrorism because the endospores are hardy and can be transported anywhere. But this is the least serious form of all the anthrax types. 20% mortality rate, and it's the least serious. All right, let's put it in perspective. We start talking about these bioterrorism threats like anthrax, and when we start to get to talking about like the plague and stuff. Next is ringworm. Ringworm, despite its name, is not worm. Okay, this is not a worm-based disease, not a helminth, right? This is caused by fungus. There's different kinds of fungal infection that we would call a ringworm type infection. They're all more scientifically known as cutaneous, being skin-based, mycoses. So these are fungal infections. So mycosis is a fungal infection. Mycoses is the multiple. The organisms that are associated with creating these cutaneous mycoses are called dermatophytes. There's a lot of different species, that says 39 different ones, that can lead to the development of these different presentations of cutaneous mycosis, but it's not caused by worms. Most of these conditions are called tinea something, which is Latin for worm, because they thought in the past that it was worm-based, but it is not, it is fungal. Here are some versions that might want to be aware of. Tinea capitis is in the scalp, So we're talking about ringworm of the scalp, so fungal infections in the scalp. Ringworm of the beard is Tinea barbae. Ringworm of the body is Tinea corporis. Ringworm of the groin is Tinea cruris. Ringworm of the foot is Tinea pedis. This is athlete's foot. Yeah, it's not anything crazy. Like this, we know these. These are common fungal infections on the body. They're just technically ringworms because they're cutaneous mycoses. Okay. And then ringworm of the nail, which is just fungal infections of the nail bed. Tinea, oh my gosh, unguium, sure. Yeah, superficial mycoses are the ones that aren't going to be causing any serious tissue damage associated with them. So you'll see presentation of pathogenesis, you'll see disease, you'll see effects of infection, but it's not necessarily inflammatory. It just, you can see it, is what I'm trying to say. So no damage to the tissue, but it does present. So this is going to include something called Tinea versicolor. This just means that this yeast infection, Malassezia, and remember yeast are fungal, so this is a mycosis, causes pigmentation shifts in melanocytes that lead to the development of skin color. So this will cause patches of different colors of skin. It is curable with antifungal treatments. There's other conditions that are considered superficial, like folliculitis, psoriasis, and seborrheic dermatitis. These guys are, unsightly maybe. They have visible effects, but they are not necessarily harmful. They're superficial. So this is some images of Tinea versicolor presentation. This is one way to have skin color presentation like this. This is our infectious superficial cutaneous mycosis, but there's other ways to have your skin have these different colors of patches. This isn't the only one, so I just want to be clear about that. All right, we're moving on to the eye now. So the eye has a lot of protective aspects to it. We're talking about the conjunctiva. This is the part of the eye that is exposed to the environment. So here, this is a membrane-like tissue over the eye, the eyelids, everything like that helps protect the eye, secretes oil and mucus, and tears will also help flush out everything as well. So even though we don't have keratin as our waterproofing protein, we don't have that thick layer of skin holding everything, our conjunctiva and the tears and the fluids and mucus will help protect our eye. Your cornea is the dome-shaped portion covering the eye. It's a layer that acts as our windshield of the eye to protect the inner layers of the eye. Tears, again, once again, these are going to be involved in flushing out things from the eye, whether it's debris or microbes that can contain lysozyme to help break down cell walls of bacteria. The eye is a site of immune privilege, meaning that essentially we don't want to have an overreactive inflammatory response in the eye because it can cause damage to the eye tissue and lead to vision loss. So you don't want that because in the history of mankind, if you're dealing with predators potentially attacking you, you need to be able to see. And generally we want to see, right? So you don't want to go blind from your inflammatory response. So we have a more regulated response in the eye than we might have in other parts of the body to protect you from the damage of inflammation, and reduced response of our lymphocytes as well. We're going to talk about immune privilege more in the next chapter in the nervous system, because again, you don't want to go blind from the inflammation. You don't want to go paralyzed from it either. So we'll talk about that next chapter. Conjunctivitis is itis. Anytime you guys hear itis, and this is going to come up over and over and over and over and over again. Itis means inflammation. So this is inflammation of the conjunctiva, your outer protective coating of your eyes and eyelids. Bacterial infections lead to a milky discharge, whereas viral and allergic, we have clear fluid associated with those. You have redness, swelling, and photophobia, which is just sensitivity to light. This is what we call pink eye. So this is an image of a baby that has neonatal conjunctivitis. This is clearly the bacterial version. We have that yellowish, milky discharge associated with this. All right, next is ocular trachoma. Ocular trachoma, or just trachoma, is caused by a bacterium called Chlamydia trachomatis. Chlamydia should sound familiar to everybody in here because it is a sexually transmitted infection. The bacteria that causes the sexually transmitted version of chlamydia is also called Chlamydia trachomatis. It's the same bacteria. So trachoma is the leading, not just a major, but the leading cause of blindness around the world infectiously. So leading infectious cause of blindness. as far as that goes. So it's probably something you may not have heard of, but believe me, in third world countries, they know of it. So this causes nodules to form on the underside of the eyelid, and those nodules will rub on the cornea and cause scarring of the cornea. And that can be linked to a blindness as a result of that. It can be permanent, but it also can be treated if caught early enough on with antibiotics, because chlamydia trachomatis is a bacteria. Next is keratitis. This is more severe version. Like if you had conjunctivitis going on and that led on to keratinization of your cornea and stuff like that, can lead to vision disruption and corneal destruction as well. It's usually introduced by trauma to the eye, even small versions of trauma, such as you get diagnosed as needing contact lenses, and you have to get used to wearing contact lenses at first because your eye isn't accustomed to it. So you eventually get scarring of your cornea where contacts aren't an issue anymore. But in the beginning, or if you change to a different brand or a different size of contact, it kind of abrades your cornea and can make it susceptible to infection if you're not washing your hands or storing your contacts effectively. Most commonly, this is caused by herpes simplex virus 1, HSV1, herpes simplex virus. It becomes latent in your nerves and will re-expose itself as cold sores in your mouth, as oral herpes. HSV1 can also cause genital herpes, though. Both HSV1 and HSV2 can cause oral herpes and genital herpes, and they do not protect from one another. So don't misconstrue this. People think, oh, I have a cold sore. It's not genital herpes. It's not on your genitals, so it's not genital herpes, but it's the same. It can be. That's what I'm saying. It's the same virus, it's just where it is. So if you get it misdirected to your eye, it can lead to keratitis. It's usually from poor handling of contact lenses, washing your hands. Acanthamoeba is also a common version of keratitis in the eye. This is an amoeba that is found in warm water, tap water. It's commonly found in hot water tanks and freshwater lakes. This is the brain-eating amoeba, by the way. I just told you you can get brain-eating amoeba from your contact lenses if you don't handle them properly. So keep that in mind. It's 97% mortality rate if it does get in your brain. So yeah, good luck with that. Wash your hands, use your sterile saline solutions. It's very, very uncommon though. So just FYI, I'm not trying to scare you, but do be aware of it. River blindness is our last one. This is a chronic parasitic infection. The worm that causes this infection is Onchocerca volvulus. It's transmitted by black flies. We see all these images of these children in third world countries with flies landing on their eyes, their faces. They don't even bother to swat them off because they're just around all the time. They're just used to them. They transmit the eggs into the kids. The larvae move into the eye, and the worm takes house in the eye. It's an actual worm. You can see it in the eyeball. The worm itself is infected with a bacterium called Wolbachia. This bacterium, if you can take an antibiotic to kill the bacteria, you'll cure your worm infection. Pretty crazy. They give antibiotics like doxycycline. In fact, if you have heartworms in your dog, some vets are good about giving doxycycline along with like the ivermectin treatments, because if you can kill the bacteria that's in those worms, those microfilariae that are involved in creating the older worms, you can kill the bacteria that's in there, you can kill them from being infectious. Pretty crazy to think that a bacteria is driving the infectious processes of the worm, but that's the case. So that's the bacteria involved in that. So we're out of time, so we won't go over the questions, but I will walk through them. All right, what pathogen does the coagulase test identify? That's going to be Staphylococcus aureus. Remember, it makes that coagulase that coagulates the rabbit plasma. Which organism causes gas gangrene? That's Clostridium perfringens. Smallpox, is it caused by a virus, bacteria, prion, or protozoa? It is a virus. What disease does parvovirus B19 cause? That's fifth disease. So it's that slap cheek effect that the red cheeks rash that we talked about. All right, what pathogen causes the most common infectious cause of blindness in the world? And that was trachoma. That is Chlamydia trachomatis. And that's it. Cool, let's go collect. Anybody have any questions about that stuff? So those last questions that I had, I know there's open questions that I was going to ask you guys, but I got carried away talking about tobacco descent again. those are the types of questions that you will see regarding Unit 4. I mean, it's going to be a lot of questions like that about these diseases. So things like, is it a virus? Is it a bacteria? Which organism? That sort of stuff. What?